As I put my car into park, a grimace formed upon my face. This would have been the 4th disappearance of the month. Stepping out of my car into the night, I trudged up the path leading to the house and began to prepare myself mentally for what I was about to hear. I've always hated missing persons cases. I think anyone would, but this one was different. When I finally reached the door, I took a deep breath and then broke the silence with a few quick raps to the door. I waited for maybe 15 seconds, but those seconds stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could hear rustling inside, then 2 pairs of frantic footsteps approaching. The door swung open and I was bombarded by the incoherent babbling of an older woman, who I could only assume to be the girl's mother. Hey, calm down, it will be okay. I'm just gonna need to get some information. I looked over to her father. He was a shorter man, heavy-set, and had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He seemed less concerned, or at the least, much more calm. I tried to look him in the eye, but I failed. Finally, I spoke. So, why don't you tell me what you can about your daughter? Age, what she looks like, where she was last seen, and so on. Well, she's 16, just got her license, has long blonde hair. Most of this was information I'd already know, but I took out my notepad anyways and began writing down what he said. And when was the last time you saw her, sir? I asked. Well, last night she went out with her friends, to wherever to hang out. Told her to be home by 12, and she never came back. Called her phone, but she ain't never picked up. She's been gone for almost a whole day now, so I figured we should probably report it. And her name? Ann Walker. I took a moment to gather myself and prepared to depart. I wanted to be out of there. I didn't want to deal with another missing persons case. You have any other information that could potentially be helpful? I asked. Not really. I told you all I can remember. I sighed. Well, then I have to get going. If you know anything else, make sure to give us a call anytime. You've given us a lot of good information. I'm sure we'll find her in no time. That was a lie. I didn't know why I said it, but I did. As I turned to return to my car, I heard the door shut behind me, then heard the mother's hysterics start once more. I returned to my car and slumped into the driver's seat. I turned the keys in the ignition and was finally able to escape the silence of the night. When I returned to the station, I quickly went into my office, slammed down the notepad, and then suffered through the monotony of the night. I told myself that I would search the next day. When I finally got home, I collapsed into my bed, but found myself restless. Eventually, I was taken by sleep. When I woke up, my whole body was sore. My bones ached. My mind felt as though it was put through a blender. That night was restless, and I felt horrible. That didn't change the fact that I had to go to work and investigate. I didn't expect any leads. Maybe I was being pessimistic, but I didn't care. In my mind, I was being realistic. Despite my body crying out in disdain towards even the thought of doing anything productive today, I knew that it was my job to look into the case. Eventually, I mustered up the strength to leave my house and go to the office. When I got to the office, I quickly gathered my stuff and left. Despite my contempt for this case, along with the others this month, I made haste. I didn't get any leads at first, talking to friends, family members, and whatnot. But eventually, I got information. A friend of hers told me that she might have gone to an old abandoned high school. The high school in question was abandoned near the end of the 80s. The student body outgrew the building, and a new one was built. Now the old high school is sometimes used by teenagers to hang out and drink or get high. I'm sure this girl's parents wouldn't be fond of the fact that their daughter is out smoking and drinking. But a lead is a lead. I thanked the friend and walked back to my car. As I buckled my seatbelt, I noticed that the sun had started to set, and the chirp of the crickets had begun. I started my car and began to drive towards the old school. As I got closer to the school, the buildings became more and more broken down. They were more sparsely populated and less taken care of. The lawns were overgrown, windows were boarded up. The signs of now closed shops were faded and barely legible. Despite being only 30 or so years since the school closed, the area declined rapidly. The area was like a ghost town, but that's why kids loved it. They could get away with a lot. Eventually, I pulled into the cracked and weed-infested parking lot of the school. I parked my car and stepped out. The building was large and made of now cracked brick. It stood 2 stories tall and had large windows periodically placed upon the walls. I walked up the steps to the front door and pushed open the large metal door. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I knew it was a bad idea. I always preferred to work alone. As I entered the building, I let out a large but unsure hello. But I wasn't met with an answer. There was still enough natural light left for me to not need a flashlight when navigating the building. I was bombarded by a thick smell of must. Underneath, the tile floor was cracked from multiple years of exposure to the elements, and the sounds of my footsteps were exemplified by it. I remember going to this high school as a student. Seeing it this decrepit was sort of depressing. I turned into a classroom and looked around. There was litter all across the floor, and some desks were overturned. Most rooms I checked in the high school were like this. When I got to the cafeteria, it was more of the same. A thick, musty odor, cracked tile, and general uncleanliness. I walked towards the kitchen, but something peculiar caught my eye. The kitchen was clean. I didn't think much of it at first, but the longer I stood there, the heavier it weighed upon my mind. Alas, the sun was setting, and I knew I hadn't covered the whole school yet. And if I wanted to have a chance of finding anything, then I needed to work quickly. I left the cafeteria and began towards the stairs to the next floor. The stairs were wooden, and thus rot had consumed a large amount of them. As I walked up the stairs, I could hear creaks underneath my feet. There wasn't much of a difference upstairs. It was all the same, rotted and destroyed. As I was searching through one of my old classrooms, I heard the sounds of footsteps beneath me. "Hey, I know you're in here," I shouted, but I didn't get a response. "Your parents are looking for you. You need to come with me," I shouted once again. But again, I was met with no response. The footsteps were louder now, and more rapid. The sound of the steps more closely resembled a disoriented shuffle than a walk. "Don't run from me. Stop." I still had yet to identify the source of the footsteps, and for some reason, I was yet to pursue them either. I sprinted down the stairs, but came to a horrific realization. The steps were not running away from me. They were coming towards me. I looked down the hallway and saw the silhouette of a figure. But this figure was not human. or at least was no longer. It was hunched over, with huge shoulders and gnarled and disfigured arms. I couldn't make out most of it due to the now set sun, and for that I am thankful. I was paralyzed in fear as I stared down the hallway at the beast. In that moment, I knew what was causing the disappearances in town, and I knew what I had to do to stop the disappearances. The sudden movements of the beast shocked me into action as I reached out to my hip for my gun, but my gun wasn't there. I don't know what kind of idiot forgets their gun at the office, but evidently, I fall into that category. I didn't know what to do in that moment, so I ran. Somehow, I got out of the building and into my car. I fumbled with my keys, shoved them into the ignition, and slammed on the accelerator. I drove to the office and tried to collect myself, but I couldn't. I knew what I had to do. I just needed to do it. There was no option. I had to return to the school and shoot that thing that resides there. As I entered the office, a colleague asked me what I was doing, but I gave him an empty answer. For me to kill that thing, I couldn't tell anyone where I was going. They would just interfere and waste my time. I knew what I was doing, and no one could stop me. I grabbed my gun and walked out of the building, head down, and to my car. I swung open the door and put the key into the ignition. The night had fallen completely. I pulled out of the lot and began to drive towards the school. As I drove through the night, the buildings around the school took a more sinister look to them. Years of abandonment hadn't treated them well. Eventually, I arrived at the school once again. I gazed up at the large building that loomed overhead. I knew what was in there. Now it was my job to kill it. I walked up the steps and swung open the door. I felt the crunch of the tiles under me and readied my gun and flashlight. I walked down the hallway and swung open the various doors, but there was nothing. I checked the cafeteria and the mysteriously clean kitchen and noticed a strange door that was left hanging open, leading to darkness. But I didn't have time to investigate this door, so I turned back out of the kitchen and headed into the cafeteria. As I walked towards the doors exiting the cafeteria, I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the thing. It stood there menacingly. I raised my flashlight to get a better look at it, and noticed its face looked oddly human. I acted only instinctively and aimed my gun and began to fire. It tried to run towards me, but was stopped by the barrage of bullets. It slumped down and it died. I let out a deep sigh and looked at the now dead beast. It's over. But as I looked at the thing, I noticed something odd. It had a green tag on its ear, and one of those disposable wristbands around its arm. I bent down to see what it was, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. Experiment number 8, June 5th, 1989. This couldn't be right. What was this thing? Why was this thing? I didn't know, but if this was number 8, there could be any number more. I needed to investigate. I needed to know. I turned back towards the kitchen and began to walk. I walked for what felt like an eternity, despite it only being 10 or 15 steps. Once I was in the kitchen, I looked at the odd door that hung half open, and I knew that is where it came from. I opened the door and found a flight of metal stairs leading down to a dark room. Unlike the rest of the school, these stairs were not destroyed. In fact, they looked quite well maintained. I trudged down the stairs and into the dark room. I shone my light around the room. And suddenly, it all made sense. The room was lined with odd glass cages, and various tables and filing cabinets were filled up the middle. In some of the cages sat what I could only assume to be other experiments, but most were dead, or in the very least inactive. 30 years ago, there were a series of unexpected disappearances, all high school aged. 30 years ago, the school closed and a new one was opened. But then, why were the disappearances happening once again? I noticed something odd. There was no dust down here. It was clean. Too clean. I ran through the room and began to look at the cages with experiments in them. As I read the dates and the experiment numbers, the truth was finally revealed. Experiment number 20, May 23rd, 2021. I felt sick as I read the words. The experiments have begun once again.